Political leaders, the Bill Clintons and all of these, we've dealt with them. We don't have to go through all of them again, the Jesse Helms, the Goldwaters, the Al Gores, and all of these individuals. And I've put the pages up there, and there are many, many books that substantiate all of these names. So just about everybody who is important in the world, everybody who runs in the political sphere is involved in these clandestine operations. We saw in the lecture on Revelation chapter 17 and 13 how there would be a holy alliance and how the United States would eventually become the powerhouse for propagating a new world order. Gorbachev's summit in Malta, referred to as the gateway to the millennium of freedom, as you will remember, and the initiative came for this great movement into a new world order. Now, let us have a look at this video where George Bush has something to say on this issue.
Where institutions of freedom have lain dormant, the United Nations can offer them new life. These institutions play a crucial role in our quest for a new world order, an order in which no nation must surrender one iota of its own sovereignty, an order characterized by the rule of law rather than the resort to force.
So he says all the nations don't have to give up one iota of their sovereignty, but we want them all in a new world order. Basically, that is what he said, out of the horse's mouth. And then this terrible incident took place. And, well, there were many, many deaths. A very strange incident. But before we get to it, let's first have a look at some of the history of this issue. The United States had a problem in that it wanted to introduce anti-terrorism laws, but there was no real terrorism in the United States. And then all of a sudden, a building in Oklahoma, April 19, 1995, was gutted by explosions, and they fingered a man, Timothy McVeigh, who worked alone, they said, and brought this building down by parking a van filled with explosive outside and blowing the building to smithereens. That's the official report. Inside were women and young children, and if anything gets the sympathy of the people, well, then that is surely one of them. Let's have a look at what happened here.
Through federal authorities that a second bomb has been found inside that federal building in Oklahoma City. It was an explosion at 9 o'clock this morning that did that damage you're looking at right there.
That was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there. The second explosive was found and diffused. The third explosive that was found, and they are working on right now as we speak, I understand, both the second and third explosives, if you can imagine this, were larger than the first. First bomb that was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there.
So you heard there on national television that a second bomb went off and it did the damage that you saw over there. They found a third explosive device within the building. The official report, however, says what? That there was a van outside with explosives. Now, I was not there. So I'm not going to set myself up as a judge as to what happened over there. I can merely say what the report said, what the news said, and then we'll ask some questions, and you decide what happened over there. Timothy McVeigh apparently worked alone, just like in the Kennedy case, and he blew this place up. But eyewitnesses say, no, they saw two individuals, and they saw this truck on a previous day, and they had a number. But when this building exploded, there was no real crater where this truck is supposed to have exploded. Now, if a truck explodes outside the building, there must be a crater, and the building must implode. But the building didn't implode, it exploded. And that was done by a device on the inside, as you heard over here. So now, to fit the case and to say it was a truck, the people said, well, surely if it was a truck, then there must be some parts left of that truck. I mean, an explosion doesn't just get rid of every piece of a truck. It might be in smithereens, but there should be a piece of an engine block or something like that. There was nothing. Eventually, the pressure became so great that a CIA agent jogging 4 blocks away stumbled over the rear axle of the truck and found it. But the problem was, how do you identify this rear axle as part of that truck? Now, they had a registration number, and fortunately the number was on the rear axle. Now, nowhere in the whole world do you put registration numbers of vehicles on rear axles. So this is a strange issue. But anyway, he was fingered as the sole one. But there is so much suspicion surrounding this explosion, and then eventually a firm got the contract and they gutted that building before there was any possibility of looking into what happened at that particular event. Then came another event, the Twin Towers. Now, what happened after the first event? After the Oklahoma bombing, the United States, within just 5 days, had anti-terrorism legislation. And that anti-terrorism legislation gave powers to the President of the United States where he could suspend the Constitution. But it didn't give powers where the United States could unilaterally enter any country in the world to do as it pleased. For that, it needed a war-footing legislation, as was the case with Pearl Harbor. There needed to be an incident. Well, an incident arrived in that the Twin Towers were destroyed. President Bush speaks to the United Nations General Assembly November 10, 2001.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
Now, isn't it interesting that George Bush there said, let us not tolerate conspiracy theories that shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves. Why? Because so many people started believing that everything was not right with these particular issues. Now, let's have a look at the first hit. When this happened, the first aeroplane struck.
We've been preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense.
We are, as we have been saying this morning, in a...
So what we have footage of the very first airplane striking that building. That means there was an opportunity to record that. Very quickly, the following happened.
Even as the leaders of the Taliban deny any role in this, an Arab journalist based in London is quoted today to the Associated Press as saying that followers of Osama bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago they were going to carry out this sort of an attack.
The chief of safety of the fire department of New York City told me he received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
45 minutes into the taping that we were doing, there was an explosion. It was way up where the fire was, and the whole building at that point bellied out in flames, and everybody ran.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of, antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
And then all of a sudden it started like like it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
All right, so the eyewitnesses said that they heard secondary devices, bang, 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 and a series of explosions, and then these buildings came down. Demolition experts said that this is exactly what happens in a controlled demolition. You see, when an aeroplane strikes, there was a huge fireball, and the fireball is the burning of all the fuel on board the aeroplane. So there was nothing left there to explode. What was responsible for the secondary explosions? If we look at the setup, you will see there are the Twin Towers, and there are buildings all around, and these buildings were either slightly damaged or not seriously damaged. And then there is a road, and there's another building over there called building number 7, and that building came down sometime afterwards, although nothing hit it. And not much was ever said about that. What caused building number 7 to implode? Let's watch it.
Okay, now watch
8
close.
hours after the
Right here
first
it is.
plane crash, a third building at the World Trade Center collapses. This one, the number 7 World Trade Center building.
This is a look at the flying
Now you'll
debris
see
from the
7
number
coming
7
down,
tower. You're going to see
and
that
watch the
almost
explosion
coming down
coming
the
this
street
way.
toward the camera. Number 7 tower at the World Trade Center.
The CIA would have been in there normally, but they had, of course, abandoned the building when the event of catastrophe occurred.
So who would have been in that building? The CIA would have been in that building, but they had evacuated the building, and 8 hours afterwards the building comes down in a controlled, it seems, implosion. Now, nothing hit that building, and these are very strange questions that we have to consider. After this event, there was a Canadian response.
And there was a great resolution passed at the United Nations last night that might bring about a new order in the world that would be better for all of us.
All of this was brought upon us in a single day. And night fell on a different world. A world where freedom itself is under attack.
So the Canadian response was this could bring about a new order in the world as it was decided at the United Nations after a meeting. Gary Hart, what did he have to say?
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order.
Tim, your life is going to change, but more important, your son's life is going to change forever. America will never be the same after September 11th.
We've been preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense.
We are, as we have been saying this morning, in a state of war.
Even as the leaders of the Taliban deny any role in this, an Arab journalist based in London is quoted today to the Associated Press as saying that followers of Osama bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago they were going to carry out this sort of an attack.
The chief of safety of the fire department of New York City told me he received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his quickly, but he said that there was another explosion which...
All right, that's enough. We've seen the buildings coming down. We've heard that while these things were still happening, the American government had fingered the culprits. A bunch of terrorists, naming their names, about 25 of them altogether, and the whole plot had been resolved by the end of the events that unfolded that day. An amazing piece of detective work after the event, while it was even happening. Now, again, let me say, I was not there. So let me tell you what has transpired and what people have said about these issues in the world, what has been published and what is facts that cannot be disputed. And then I don't make a judgment because I wasn't there. You make the judgment based on the facts. This is the story. They say the terrorists were of Arab extraction, and they mentioned the names of the passengers on these aeroplanes, which were United Airlines aeroplanes. And the mastermind behind the scene is a man by the name of Atta, who is fingered as the one who received instruction on how to fly an aeroplane. Well, when they released the names, immediately there was a hue and cry from the Arab countries because 5 of the terrorists, supposed terrorists, mentioned that they were very much alive and well and couldn't have been on the plane. Right? Very important. They were alive and well and couldn't have been on the plane. How did they know that Atta was the mastermind? You see, on his way to the airport, he had just happened to leave his documents in the taxi that was transporting him. So they had his documentation. Which terrorist would leave his documentation behind? That is the one question. The next point that is very interesting is that they have evidence that he was the man because he wrote a suicide note. This is all fact. This is all published fact, what I'm saying now. I'm not making this up. This is all referenced. This is a fact. You decide the rest for yourself. Now, he wrote a suicide note. And this suicide note, he then placed within his suitcase. And then he handed in the suitcase, as we normally do when we go onto the aeroplane. Now, which person would write a suicide note that was going to be destroyed in an aeroplane crash? Does that make any sense? So the fact of the matter is they have a suicide note. But now the question is, if he handed in his suitcase to be put on top inside the plane, how come they have the suicide note? Well, just by chance, this is the one suitcase they forgot to put on the plane. And that is how they have his note. How do they know there were Arab terrorists in there? Because a passport. Nothing else survived that plane crash, but a passport fell out, and it happened to be a burnt-out passport, which still could identify one of the terrorists. This is very circumstantial. Now, as these aeroplanes, with absolute precision, struck those twin towers, their black boxes were totally obliterated. These are of titanium and are designed to survive such crashes. There is no evidence of them whatsoever. They have been totally destroyed. So we have a very strange situation. What hit building number 7? Nothing hit it, but it came down in like fashion. And there is plenty of evidence that there were possibly secondary devices in the buildings, as you heard from the commentators themselves. So what about the infrastructure of the airplanes? Well, there are certain parts lying there, so there was definitely a situation where those planes hit that particular building, because you have wheels and all kinds of components of the airplanes surviving even those crashes. With those tremendous explosions, there were parts of these aircrafts everywhere. Every time an airplane crashes, there are huge pieces of fuselage and etc. which remain, and they sometimes can fit all these things together, and that was also the case at the Twin Towers. 3 days before those buildings came down, 3 days before, the shares in the airlines had been sold at a turnover such as had not existed ever before. And certain banks bought these. So somebody might have been tipped off that something was going on. And then a very interesting case, there was a man in your country, in Canada, who happened to be in prison. And they had caught him in a gambling situation, and they imprisoned him, and he said, "Let me go, I am clandestinely working for the CIA. I'm an agent, I was investigating money laundering, etc., etc., etc." And they would not let him go. Then he gave the names of his contacts at the CIA, and the CIA was probably embarrassed because of this situation and denied knowledge of it, and he was very angry because he felt he had been stabbed in the back. And this very often happens in this industry. And so he wrote a letter before the September 11 attack outlining some events that were going to take place, and he mentioned that aircraft were going to fly into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. Now, nobody made any use of these, but when it actually happened, then this came to the fore. So here was a CIA agent who said ahead of time that this was going to happen. Could be chance, could not be chance. You decide for yourself. A certain Atta, the man who is supposed to have planned this, with only in-flight training, with absolute precision, they went into those buildings. This is an amazing story. Received funds, $100,000 US, from Pakistan's secret service into his bank accounts. And they worked very closely with the United States. So here had been a transfer of money, but the plot doesn't end there. Das Böse sitzt im Pentagon. Facts. The evil sits in the Pentagon. Now, who is this man that wrote this? This is the political scientist Thierry Meyssan from France, and he has some very interesting to say. Who was it? What happened over here? How come they had all the names of all these people, and yet there is no real evidence that these people were actually on board? Here's the story. I'm just giving it to you with the passengers, the machines that flew into these Twin Towers. And then there's this fascinating case of the other aeroplane that went into the Pentagon. And here are the pictures that were published. The dates were strangely wrong. They were September 12, but apparently they said it's because they released them the next day. And what you see is smoke over there. There are no debris pots, nothing. Here is a piece missing, no picture. There you have an impact of a flame, and you have this fireball over here. That's it. If you look then on the lawn, this is all that was found, but no part of a United Airlines aircraft. No parts. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. This is the hole that was seen after the event, and most of this hole happened well after the event. So the question is, why are there no aircraft parts? Again, all the black boxes disappeared. There were no black boxes that survived, and the hole is way too small for something like that to actually have happened. Because nowhere in the world, even in the Lockerbie disaster, there was a case where there were no aircraft parts. Nothing. There was just nothing. What is even more interesting in this situation is when you look at this, when the United States rules the world, the Catholic Church will rule the world. Archbishop Quigley, 1903. Let me go back to this September 11. To rule the world, you have to be able to have access to the entire world whenever you want to, however you want to. Now, this aeroplane that struck the Pentagon, and the other one that fell by chance, did you know about that? The other one that fell, and apparently there were terrorists on board that were overcome by loyal citizens. The interesting part is that that aeroplane struck the ground and never struck any building. It came down. And as it came down, there was a hole in the ground. And the mayor and the first people of that area ran to the place, and here was a hole in the ground, but no aircraft debris. None. None whatsoever. Not the slightest piece. Nothing. So the whole aircraft disappeared into a hole which was not very large, and there was no debris and no black boxes and nothing. Something like this has never, ever happened ever before. But what is even more sinister is the following. Because the people that had died on the aeroplane, their descendants or their inheritors, cannot claim if there is no body. But in the investigation, they identified every single human body with their blood group and body parts that were given to all the family. There were no aircraft parts. There was nothing of that nature found, no aeroplane whatsoever. And yet, they could identify everybody. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And there were apparently phone calls between the aircraft and the Pentagon. Such was the information that was released. And the information was that there was a terrorist group, Arab terrorists, that were attacking this place, and the phone call was made with a handy, with a cell phone. But then, of course, they found out that if you make a phone call with a cell phone, then you get an account for that phone call. And there was no record of such a phone call. So the Pentagon backtracked one and said, yes, excuse me, we didn't actually get the phone call from a cell phone. We got it from the onboard telephone. That's how it happened. And again, they did an investigation. If you make a telephone call on an onboard phone, then you swipe your credit card through it, and there must be a record of a credit card transaction from that phone. But there was no record. So the Pentagon backtracked again and said, yes, that is true, but it was done as a collect call. That's why there was no credit card, because the individual had forgotten the credit card. But you cannot make a collect call from an onboard telephone. And there the story died. So here are 4 aircraft, no parts except the ones at the Twin Towers. There are holes in the ground and no aircraft whatsoever, but all the pieces of the bodies with the DNA analyses. These are interesting, very interesting facts. They had planned previously in the Bay of Pigs one such operation, apparently, this is history, where they were going to dupe the world by having one aircraft take off, land, the people get out, and then another one, radio controlled, take off and create the situation that they wanted without any people on board. This had been done before in the United States. So ask yourself the following questions. How is it possible that all this circumstantial evidence points to nobody out there? Nobody out there. Then came anthrax scares. And when eventually someone high up in politics suggested that it seems to come from a laboratory within, suddenly there was absolute silence. So let us not continue with the September 11 and ask and say it was this or that party. The fact of the matter is this is a very strange situation. Heroes of Flight 93, the official version, is that this plane was heading, let's say, for example, for the White House or for the Capitol building, but that some heroes on board overpowered the pilot, and then the plane crashed onto the ground, killing all the occupants. Very fascinating stuff. By the way, of all the 4 airplanes involved, no black box has been found. No black box. They are designed to withstand such crashes. There is not one that has remained. Now at Shanksville, what happened here? Now this we don't have in English, it's in German, so subtitles have been put underneath and you can read it in English as you go along, and we can see what happened. Here the people come, and they now interview the mayor of Shanksville, who was one of the first at the scene, as to what actually was present when they arrived. And you will find something very interesting.
Ernie Stahl, der Bürgermeister der nahegelegenen Gemeinde Shanksville, erinnert sich.
Well, yeah.
Ja, mein Schwager und ein guter Freund von mir waren die Ersten hier. Sie haben in Shanksville an einer Straßenecke gestanden und sich unterhalten. Ihr Wagen stand gleich in der Nähe und so waren sie die Ersten hier. Dann kam erst die Feuerwehr. Alle waren wie vor den Kopf gestoßen, weil sie zu einem Flugzeugabsturz gerufen wurden. Aber da war kein Flugzeug. Kein Flugzeug. Sie wurden hier zu der Unfallstelle geschickt und da war kein Flugzeug? Nein, da war nichts. Nur dieses Loch. Das ist es, was Sie sahen. Ich dachte immer, das sei die Absturzstelle. Das ist sie. Aber da ist nichts zu sehen. Das Flugzeug hat sich total zerlegt. Puff. Es krachte auf den Boden und löste sich auf. Vollkommen. Sage.
Flugzeugtrümmer? Nicht.
Stolz präsentiert die Fotografin ihr Werk genau an der Stelle, von der aus sie das Bild geknipst hat. Eine pilzförmige Rauchsäule, wie sie auch von anderen Augenzeugen beobachtet wurde. Das ist das, was wir gesehen haben. Sieht fast aus wie ein Pilz. Afghanistan. Nach einem Bombeneinschlag bildet sich genau die gleiche pilzförmige Rauchsäule wie in Shanksville. War es doch eine Bombe oder eine Rakete?
That's an interesting story. So here you have an interview with the eyewitnesses that come to the crash site and there's no airplane. But there's a hole in the ground. And in the hole, nothing. No airplane. No airplane debris, nothing. Just a hole in the ground. In which a whole Boeing disappeared, totally dissolving itself, with nothing to show. Interestingly, they have the bodies of every single one that was on board. But there's no airplane. Now, that is weird. You must admit, that's kind of weird. And that is the picture of the actual cloud that formed. This photographer just happened to be there when it happened. And that is the cloud that forms when a bomb hits, like they used in Afghanistan. And the question was asked, was it perhaps a bomb and not an aeroplane at all? And where is the aeroplane? We wouldn't know, it's gone. Now, nowhere in the history of the world has an airplane like that just disappeared. I mean, imagine when your shuttle exploded up there, what a terrible disaster that was. And that was like a nuclear explosion in mid-air. They could almost reconstruct that shuttle from all the debris that they put together. Isn't that correct? And here, nothing? Nothing? No airplane? It's gone. No airplane. Very interesting. Let's go and look at what happened at the Pentagon. Amongst reports circulating is the report that there was an explosion in the Pentagon. Now, according to this, an airplane flew into the Pentagon. Let's have a look what was aired on national television abroad.
Von einer Explosion ohne jegliche Beteiligung eines Flugzeugs im Inneren des Pentagon wird berichtet. Übrigens, die Fassade knickte erst später ein. Das war keine unmittelbare Folge des Aufpralls. Direkt auf den eben renovierten Teil des Pentagon zu. Nachdem das Flugzeug auf den ersten Gebäudering aufprallte, durchschlug es noch 2 weitere Ringe, um am Ende dieses 1,80 Meter große Loch zu hinterlassen. Wie schon bei dem Absturz in Shanksville löste sich auch hier das Flugzeug in Luft auf, beziehungsweise pulverisiert. Auch nicht im Inneren des Gebäudes. Dafür nichtssagende Details. Eine Uhr, ein verkohltes Telefon, verrußte Räume. Einrichtungsgegenstände.
Well, there you have it. That's the second one. Here comes an aeroplane, crashes into the Pentagon, goes through a hole, leaves a hole 1.8 meters wide. A whole airplane leaves a hole 1.8 meters wide. The rest of it collapsed later inside the building. No airplane debris. It's completely dissolved, gone. But there are clocks and there are telephones and furniture. They seem to have survived. Nothing else. No engine block, no nothing survived. No airplane. Whereas, if you go to the World Trade Center, where everybody saw the airplanes fly in, what do you find there? This is the situation.
Ganz anders die Situation am World Trade Center. Trotz der viel massiveren Zerstörung stolpert man hier förmlich über Flugzeugteile.
There was no problem there. That was a massive explosion. If anything should have ripped those planes apart, it should have been there. But there's lots of debris of airplanes. But at the Pentagon, nothing. Not a thing. At Shanksville, nothing. No airplane. Dissolved completely. The fact of the matter is that immediately after these events, the power was granted to act internationally. And you had massive legislation, homeland response, all of these things came in. Now, I'm not saying who it was, I'm not saying what transpired, I'm just giving you the facts as they were, and you decide whether the official version is okay.